Good evening. Welcome to the historic Wayne Theater, Ross Performing Arts Center. We are so glad that you're here this evening and excited to be hosting our signature speaker series for science and especially the Virginia Natural History Museum. A couple things coming up at the Wayne Theater. This weekend, Thursday, Friday, 2 shows on Saturday and 1 on Sunday is a play, Woman in Black. It's a very immersive experience, not for young children, and it'll take place at the Wellington venue. So we hope that you will check that out if you're looking for a Halloween type of event. Also here on stage Saturday night is a George Jones and Tammy tribute. Keep sending us what you want to see on film or live on stage. We do take those suggestions seriously. And I also want to announce that we will be hosting Gerald Dickens doing A Christmas Carol, the great-great-grandson of Charles Dickens. The show is online, but we have just heard this will be his last USA tour. It's a matinee performance, so if you haven't seen that, you'll want to make sure it's on your calendar. Please check out everything we have going on our website, especially as we kick off celebrating our 10th and 100th anniversary here at the Wayne Theater. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Tom Bensing, who's on the board of the Virginia Natural History Museum.
Thank you. Thanks, Tracy, and I'd like to add my welcome to everybody that's here and online joining us as well. We do want to recognize our other sponsors in addition to the Wayne Theater and the Museum of Natural History, the South River Watershed Coalition, and if you didn't have a chance, there's a table out front in the lobby to learn more about this nonprofit group that's active in the area around water quality. As she said, I serve on the Board of Trustees for the Museum of Natural History, and tonight I have the pleasure of introducing our science speaker, Dr. Joe Keiper. Joe's the executive director of the museum, and his topic for tonight is up here already: historic bird collections, a time machine for bird conservation, and a gateway for avian appreciation. And I've known Joe for over a decade now, and during my 12 years on the board, he's been a great proponent for bringing natural history to life. And his talk, I'm sure, will be a great example of that. And another great example will be the creation of a new campus for the Museum of Natural History here in Waynesboro. Currently, we've requested that Governor Youngkin include construction funds in his upcoming 2-year budget, and we could use your help. Please contact the governor to let him know that permission to move forward was granted by the Secretary of Education, Amy Guidera, based on favorable reviews of the building design by the Department of Engineering and Buildings and a completed study and analysis using cost estimation and value engineering. Or if you want your message to be more simple and direct, just simply know that this project would bring both significant economic benefit to our region and opportunities for science education in our schools. And our specific ask is that the governor move this project into what's called the capital construction pool. That's the language. And the decision now lies in his hands. The governor's proposed budget will be announced in mid-December, and with your and his support, we could break ground in July of next year. And that's really exciting to think about and a long time in coming. So write a letter or call his office, please. And if you have questions about the Waynesboro campus or how to contact the governor, feel free to catch me after the talk. Now back to tonight's speaker. I've already told you that Joe is the executive director for the Museum of Natural History in Martinsville, where the main campus is. When he was a museum curator, he was deeply involved in the biology of invertebrate animals, but maintained a long-standing passion for birding. He interned at Chincoteague Wildlife Refuge in the summers of 1992 and 93, where he worked on conservation projects targeting the endangered piping plover, and was a teaching assistant for ornithology at Kent State University for 4 years following that time. He maintains his birding activities today, and he participates in a number of citizen science programs focused on bird populations. Once again, his topic tonight is historic bird collections, a time machine for bird conservation, and a gateway for avian appreciation. Please join me in welcoming Joe to the stage.
Thanks, Tom. All righty, good evening, everybody. Hope everyone can hear me. I've got a fancy lapel mic on, so hopefully that's working out for us. So it's great to be back. Thank you all for coming, and I want to also welcome everyone who is joining us online tonight. So we're going to talk about something that is not really part of my professional duties, though managing collections is, but the activities that I engage in as a birder have been more of a passion. You could call it a hobby if you like. It's a little awkward because, there are times as, an administrator at a museum, I have to work with our board of trustees and ensure that they get things like agendas and reports and everything ready. And sometimes I'm a little late. I wonder why. It might be because I'm out making a bird list somewhere, I hate to say. So Tom here gets to witness my passion that I address in my spare time, copious as it is. And as such, maybe, Tom, you understand why maybe an occasional report is late once in a while. So anyway, yeah, at the Natural History Museum, one of the reasons we can bring campus here is because we have a massive collection of natural history objects. And I'm going to talk about the origins of those collections and what's represented. We'll be focusing, of course, on these avian collections. And hopefully you get the understanding of what these collections are, why they're important, how we use them, and just remember this massive collection. Some of it can be brought here. If you come and visit us at the Martinsville campus, there might be 5% of our collection or less, maybe 3% of our collection on display at any one time. All the rest is kept in the vaults. In fact, we are currently going through a multi-million-dollar renovation of another building. This is the building the museum was born in more than 3 decades ago. It was a renovated school building back then. We are now giving it a second renovation so that way it can have the environmental tolerances needed to store collections, because we are bursting at the seams. And to be able to take these collections and populate exhibits up here for science outreach will be our mission once we move to the capital construction pool for the Commonwealth. But let's get right into our topic here, right? So we have a picture here. We kind of look at some of these historic collections. I'm going to revisit this image a little later on. But just to kind of start things off on a light note, as a birder, I'm going to have to share with you my 4 favorite birds from 2025. So in the upper left, we have the golden-winged warbler. This is an elusive little guy. This is a male. You see singing proudly. By the way, all these images are from Cornell University. We'll come back to them and their importance to the birding world. But unless otherwise attributed, I just am not the photographer that we see, that has the skill sets with these beautiful images we'll be looking at tonight. So the golden-winged warbler is something that, you just don't wake up in the morning and figure you're going to go see. So what you have to do is figure out where they're at based upon birding reports. And we heard one was up, or a pair was up, most likely breeding up near Mountain Lake, closer to Blacksburg. And so myself and another birder, we took an early morning trip up, staked out the spot where they had been seen, and we saw a lot of stuff, didn't see one for about a half hour before they finally showed up, and it was the buzzing call of the male that tipped us off. To its right is the Wilson's phalarope. This is a wading bird, really not a rare thing, but it comes from the western U.S., so it was a vagrant. It came, who knows why, it came across the United States, ended up in Greensboro in a mud flat. And so again, I staked out with a spotting scope at about 500 yards, and I was getting discouraged until finally it showed up and started foraging, and I was able to see one. That was my first one of my life. And speaking of lifers, the prairie falcon and the sagebrush sparrow, neither one is rare, but I had never seen one before, and that's the beauty of this. You get to explore new places, you get to see new things. It's very exciting to grow a life list. The prairie falcon, my wife spotted when we were on this terrible little dirt road near Salt Lake City. We're at the Great Salt Lake heading towards an environmental bit of public art called Spiral Jetty. And she spotted this falcon, and we were able to put the scope on it. And then the sagebrush sparrow, very common around a place called Antelope Island State Park. Because the water levels are very low, it's more like Antelope Peninsula, if you ask me. But nonetheless, it was a very pretty little thing singing amongst the sagebrush. So this is something that really gets me jazzed up, but at the same time, too, while I'm not trained in ornithology, that was not my academic background, I really wanted to get into birds a little bit more in their collections. But let me give you a few tips about how you can get started. So this is sort of a how-to. If you're not into birding now, here are some of the tools that you can use. The first thing I recommend, if you look towards the upper left, you see that logo there, I recommend you go and download to your smartphone the Merlin Bird ID app. This is available through Cornell University. And this is a screenshot of the opening screen that you get when you activate the app. But then what you can do is if you click on Explore, and this is the Southeast birding package, you can get them worldwide. So you can just clog up your phone with bird ID apparatus if you like. But this is for the Southeast, and what we see here are a variety of warblers, including the golden wing that I saw earlier in the year. And so this gives you a chance to explore and identify what you might be seeing. And it's great once you click on a species such as the fairly common, though secretive, Louisiana water thrush, the little bird that lives near streams. You can get identification photos that has plenty of opportunities to listen to its song. And you can also get a range map that you see here. There's kind of a dark green, which is the breeding range. You get the light green, which is the migration range and so forth. And then you see, it's kind of hard to make out, but you get like a light blue here. And what you're getting is the areas where these birds overwinter. I don't know whoever came up with the term bird brain, but when you think about this guy's strategy of spending the summers up here and spending the winters down in the tropics, that sounds pretty smart to me. And furthermore, there's also an opportunity to do sound ID. So by playing or turning on the sound ID while it's active, you would actually get a sonogram here, but it'll start to list the birds that the smartphone hears. So this is an opportunity for you to sometimes identify birds that are difficult to find, perhaps because they live in dense brush or something along those lines. But I have a few precautions with this when you use the sound ID. You want to be cautious when using it. Forgive the format here, but use it to give you a heads up. So just a little while ago, a week or two ago, I was at one of my frequent birding stops, and I was just playing it while I was looking around, and I looked at it, and it said that it picked up a Tennessee warbler. Well, I didn't hear a Tennessee warbler, not that I was even very familiar with the call, but it gave me the heads up, and about 10 minutes later, I saw one sulking around a bush, and that was just a real nice find for that particular site. You really need to confirm visually or audially what you have. So I will say, I know there are people literally that will go out to a site and do this with their smartphone for 10 minutes and then look at it and then record everything that's on there. That just doesn't look like fun to me. It's also probably very incorrect. I mean, I've gotten some really strange readings, like, birds that are like impossible for the site that I'm in. But things like machinery, frogs, crickets, things like that will sometimes activate it. I even one time was with a group, and they were calling out another bird, and I'm like, there's no possible way. And sure enough, we found that there was a bird only giving a partial call to its normal call, and Merlin misidentified it, right? So please be cautious with these tools. That's all it is a tool. It is not the beginning and end of your birding trip. So the second tool you'll want to download if you really want to get into it, and the reason I recommend this is for twofold. One, this is for your own personal record keeping. The second thing is it allows you to participate in citizen science projects. You, as a person with a passion for nature, can go out and you can actually make a contribution, and we'll talk about those here. So again, we have the opening screenshot here. When you start a birding list, you can begin to record the species you see, and then on the right here we have a summary from this past October 11th. Lake Lanier is a spot that I frequent, gives you a map of the spot that you walked around. It actually tracks you. So if you don't want, I know my wife's online listening to this, so I'm going to say this. If you don't want your wife to know where you're at, don't turn it on, right? So you were birding today when you were supposed to be mowing the lawn. No, I wasn't. So it also gives you the notes that you typed in, and it gives you your species list. So from a standpoint of kind of keeping your own personal records, that's awesome. But all the checklists you make get downloaded to Cornell University. There are volunteer experts who will overview lists, and if you get rarities, you better write out something about what you saw, upload a photo or a sonogram from the identification app, right? anything like that, you need to back up what you're doing. And so, in other words, just because you record something rare doesn't mean they're going to buy it, right? And actually, it takes time. I saw a bird called an olive-sided flycatcher. It was the first one ever seen for a particular site not far from Martinsville, and I recorded. I even took 2 photographs of it. They weren't great, but they were good enough for identification, and I uploaded it, and it never got approved. And I was like, God, those jerks, I tell you, come on now. And so I let it go finally after like weeks. And then it was only like last week, so it had been over 2 months. It was last week I saw that it got approved. So, but these are all volunteers, so it does take time, right? And everything that you record, the date and time, the location, the distance you walked, any notes you record, that's all recorded, and that goes to the Cornell database. And you can, if you want, you can access the raw data and do your own analyses. And you can put limits on it, so you're not just getting, any old data, that you're getting stuff from reliable, known experts in the field. So how might this be used? This is kind of a cool project here. This is a beautiful bird that I've never seen. And myself and a couple other folks, we're talking about making a road trip up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan one day in a spring. It would have to be in the springtime when they're breeding, but that's where they breed, kind of in that northern area there, particularly in Michigan. So back a few years ago, there was a group of researchers that wanted to know more about the migration patterns of this bird called the Kirtland's warbler. It only nests in pine tree stands that are maybe around 40 or so feet tall. So if they get too old, they don't like them anymore. If they're too young, they don't like them at all. And so this was actually a bird that went down to about 200 known males, but now is 10 times that size. So it is a success story in conservation. Prescribed burning and other methods have managed to preserve their habitat. And so on specific dates and specific locations, birders were asked to bring their equipment and their checklists and stake themselves out and count the number of birds they see. So what we can see here, in a little bit of a darker green here, we can see that this is actually kind of one hot spot. Makes sense. There are birds flying out across Lake Erie. They get tired and they settle in. Going to the south side of Lake Erie in the fall is a wonderful hot spot to go see birds because they have to fly across the Great Lakes and then refuel. So they'll hang out for a while and you get them in great density. So they have that bit of a small hot spot here, but then you see that they get funneled down towards Georgia and into the peninsula of Florida. And why is that? Well, it's because the only place that they spend the winter is in the Bahamas and in some of the smaller surrounding islands. So this is a bird with very restricted range, and it would be very rare to actually find one. And so, of course, another funny story I want you to notice. This might look familiar to some of you, right? You see these dots right here. Here we got the River Burger Bar, great place to go, by the way. But right here, this is Coiner Spring Park. And so last springtime, I had to drop my wife off up in Hollands, just north of Roanoke. Her brother and sister were blowing through, and they were going to grab her, and they were going to go on a long weekend. So I drove up there and dutifully dropped my wife off with them, kissed her on the cheek goodbye, got back in my car, went home, and the first thing I did was I opened up the rare bird list for the day. And I thought, oh my God, I was halfway to Waynesboro, and there's a Kirtland's warbler at Coiner Spring Park. I couldn't believe it, and I didn't have time to go. If I had looked before I left, I would have known, driven the hour and 15 minutes to the site, got the bird. I did the next best thing. I called my friend Irby Nash. His wife, Marilyn, is a birder. And I said, Irby, there's a Kirtland's warbler at Coiner Springs. And so I said, send Marilyn. And she did, and she saw it. And I was like so jealous. Oh, it was rough. It's a rough life I lead. So anyway, so you can see you can have some good fun with birding. It's also very fascinating. And it's also, I don't mean to get mushy here or anything, but it's also kind of a form of just life's betterment, your own self-betterment, that, you have a chance to learn something new and engage in new things and see new places, meet new people. You meet birders quite frequently, right? If you go to Bell's Lane, is a popular place for birding in Stanton, right? And I bump into birders all the time. You talk and you exchange phone numbers and you say, oh, I'll text you if I see something rare. And so this is just a form of self-betterment, and as we go through life, it's something that I encourage people to do. I've got none of them are going to be online. So I've got 4 brothers. None of them will be online watching this. They don't really care, right? But, I was sitting around a breakfast table with them a couple of years ago, and, Carl was talking, my second oldest brother, Carl, was talking about, oh, man, now that I'm retired, I got to find things to do. And I was like, well, Carl, what do you like? And he was like, I don't know, right? And I was like, well, didn't you play the clarinet when you were a kid? I don't want to do that. And he basically told me, he says, I don't know if I really like anything. And I was like, oh my God, how can you go through life like that? The world is such an amazing place. Go out there and get into it. And so this is one way to do it. And I have met with a lot of joy and just, I've just managed to live life effusively by going out and exploring the world as a birder and a natural historian in general. So let's get down to collections. That's what we're here for tonight. So in the birding world, in the birding collections, they come in different flavors. Now, this is not what we would call a research collection. This is what we refer to as taxidermy. So taxidermy is where, on a bird anyway, the skin and the beaker bill and the feet and legs are removed from the animal and then sewed over a form. Now, frankly said, this is just my opinion. I don't ask anyone to back me up or anything, but I don't encourage people to go do this. I don't encourage people to go hunting just for trophies and stuff. I also don't object to it, right? That, everything that we get at the Natural History Museum donated to us has to come with authorized paperwork. You have to have permits or licenses or anything like that. Otherwise, we don't accept it. So it is something that is legal, particularly when it comes to waterfowl. Other things like our songbirds and our hawks and our owls and all these other kinds of birds, that's illegal. They're protected by the 1918 Migratory Species Act, and so you're not allowed to take those. All that said, taxidermy is a way in which museums do make an attempt to develop exhibits and project scientific information for science literacy. And so taxidermy is limited in a lot of ways. One way it is very limiting is most collectors don't provide the information where it was collected, when it was collected, how it was collected, anything about the environment, latitude and longitude, all of these data that make a scientific specimen a specimen, right? So these are great for our exhibits and to demonstrate biodiversity and so forth, and we do utilize them in exhibits. And in fact, we have salvaged some collections over recent years with the anticipation of bringing them here specifically to Waynesboro to teach people about the wonderful world and its biodiversity. Now, there is one way in which, this is both a birding thing and a collections thing, there's one way in which we can kind of illustrate something special about birds, and that is identification. In other words, we look at field markings. So this is a very common duck. This is called the ringneck duck. Now, a lot of people look at these things and they're like, well, Joe, I see the ring on the bill. How come it's not called a ringbill duck? And I'm like, I have no clue. I've never figured that out, right? Because it has this distinctive ring around the bill. There's a ringbill gull, which is also very common. So maybe some ornithologist years ago said, I don't want anyone to confuse the two. So they call it the ringneck. But how do you call it a ringneck? You can barely see it in this photo. There's a slight kind of fluorescence here around the neck. And when you take a flash photo, it comes out a little more sharply right here, and I've never seen that in the field. I have never seen that, right? So I can see it in the specimens. You must have to have perfect conditions to actually see it. I've seen thousands of these ducks, and I've never seen the ring on the neck out in the field, right? But it does provide an educational opportunity, not just about the biology of the birds, but also for identification, and that is what we call taxonomy, the naming of species and so forth. That was something Marshall talked about at last month's talk. So that's a couple of ways in which we use them for exhibits, for field markings, and therefore education towards identification and whatnot. But these are the kind of specimens here that, one, tend to freak the people out the most, right? Because you got all these just massive series of dead birds, right? But don't get grossed out quite yet, or don't get too judgmental. Let me get through the whole story here, right? Here we have a whole series of various sparrows, right? And you notice they all have their toe tags. All those toe tags have that data. These are called study skins. These study skins are prepared in a certain way such that they are available for study of morphology. And I will continue to describe these as we move along. But again, those tags that are attached to the feet are incredibly important. In fact, some people would say, one, if they lack those tags, they're not a scientific specimen. The second thing is the information on those tags is more important than the specimen itself, because that tag, along with all the other tags, can tell a story about a species, about a population, about a conservation effort, about a decline in species, or the history of a species. So let's talk about one particular story. I asked Marshall, who some of you met last month. He's one of our research technicians in vertebrate biology, and I said, hey, can you find a pelican for me? Right? And he said, sure, I can. So he went out and he got this pelican. It's the brown pelican. If anyone here has gone to the beach, the Atlantic Coast beach, you have seen these, 100%. Very, very common, but that wasn't always the case. Here's what you would have seen. You would have seen these flocks of brown pelicans flying over the wave tops. Again, very, very abundant. Let's take a look at the tag and what we can learn from this. First of all, what you see here is Pelecanus californicus. Well, that is not true anymore. There used to be the brown pelican of the east, and then you had the California brown pelican, so two different species. But as time went on and the science kind of became more into focus, ornithologists combined those. What's called a synonymy. They synonymized those two species into one. Now they're considered subspecies. So they're a little bit different than one another, but if they encountered each other, they could still mate and have viable offspring. But notice it says endangered. That's an outdated tag. We need to update that. The good thing about this is that the brown pelican, both the eastern and western form, were taken off the endangered species list in 2009. Well, why was it on the endangered species list? By the way, this comes from Monterey Bay in California. Notice the date of collection, right? So this is a very old specimen, August 5th, 1936. Next year it'll celebrate its 90th birthday as a scientific specimen, and we hold it in perpetuity. Now, you might be wondering, you're like, Joe, I know a little bit about the museum. You guys aren't that old, right? You know, what are you, 40 years old or something like that, right? What are you doing with a specimen from 1936? Well, as the museum started in the 1980s, the collections, which were the primary focus of the opening of the museum, that was the purpose of the museum. If you read the Code of Virginia and the purposes of the Virginia Museum of Natural History, there are 6 of them. 5 of the 6 of them specifically talk about the understanding of the natural world through scientific processes and the management of collections. And that's what separates us from a university. We are totally collections-based. So when we first started, we took on orphan collections. VCU, UVA, Virginia Tech, University of Richmond, and others, they didn't really want to hang on to collections and dedicate space to it. That was an old-time thing, right? You know, that was something that universities did in the early 20th centuries and prior to that. As time went on, administrators realized collections don't pay tuition. So we need to free this space up, and that's what happened. So we became that central repository for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So that's how we got these things. But getting back to the brown pelican, you know, how did they become endangered? Well, you probably all know this story. Back in, the 1940s, 50s, there was the advent and application of DDT, an insecticide, very effective, but also it's something that persists within the environment and has a lot of negative effects. Because it persists within fatty tissue, probably most of us who are of a certain age, if we had an analysis done on us, we could still find trace amounts in DDT within our bodies today, right? So what happened, though, is certain kinds of birds suffered from DDT. They suffered through a process called bioaccumulation. So you would spray insects and they would die, but different kinds of critters would eat them, and then birds would eat those critters, and as they accumulated all of this DDT in their system, it started to have bad physiological processes. And so when pelicans and other birds, the most famous example being the bald eagle, that was kind of the poster child, but brown pelican was a great example as well. What happens is that the DDT interrupted the process of laying down calcium during egg development, making very thin shells, and when birds went to incubate their eggs, the simple weight of the parent would crush the egg. Right? And so this caused a massive decline. There was no more breeding. Older adults were dying off, but there were very few young that were being born. So DDT eventually becomes outlawed, and various other conservation methods are applied. And the other thing, the historic collections were valuable. This showed conclusively by looking at old collections, and if you look at this one, this is collected on March March 26, 1917. So we're getting on 110 years for this egg set right here. What we found, of course, is that, if back in 1917, before application of DDT, eggshells were of appropriate thickness. When we got into post-DDT application, that those eggshells were very thin when you measured the broken shells, and then as time goes on and you measure eggshell thickness, it's back to the historic levels. And of course, the brown pelican is a great example of a conservation success. We're going to look at some more labels and stuff. I do love these, as I've kind of spent time in natural history collections looking at these labels and the stories recorded by the collectors. We might now look back and be like, God, what were these people thinking, collecting all these birds? Now this was, I don't know about the eggs here, right? These were not collected dead. These apparently were collected, just basically stolen from a nest. The previous specimen was collected dead, apparently. But all that said, it's just one of those things where you can look back on the stories that these people, in this case, the Carpenters, the couple from California, what they recorded about that time. It becomes very fascinating. You can get really sucked into it. So here's another example. On the left here, far left, you have short-tailed albatross. It's an exotic species. I put a pen next to it so you can see the sheer size of this guy. These are some of the biggest birds in the world, right? And again, these are endangered, and so you can see here, whoops, wrong button. All right, you can see here this old museum number. This is not from our museum, VPI. Where did this come from? Yeah, from Tech, back when it was called Virginia Polytechnic Institute, right? So this was a short-tailed albatross that was collected. Now this is one that the historic records are important because it shows an historic distribution. The short-tailed albatross is now restricted to 4 Pacific islands near Hawaii, Taiwan, and Japan, and that's it, right? So this is one that folks are keeping a close eye on because it's suffering. Habitat loss, introduction of invasive species like rats that get into nests and depredate eggs and so forth become a real problem. But yeah. So while we're just looking at individual birds, we can also look at series. This is a least sandpiper, not a wholly uncommon bird that we can see not here during breeding season, but we can see here in Virginia during spring migration and fall migration. So again, they will migrate down to southern climes, but they are going to breed in more northern areas of the United States and Canada up through the Arctic Circle. So we have here a series, and again, all of these labels here paint an historic picture. And it's not just our collection, but when you begin to combine these collections and the data that is contained with them, with other museums, you begin to get a global story. And even the study skins themselves, even though they have the primary scientific purpose of looking at, say, morphology as opposed to showing the animal in its lifelike condition, one of the, we call these birds peeps because they all kind of look the same. They're little brown jobbers that run around wet areas and whatnot. Very difficult to identify, and certainly on some days I struggle. Right? The least sandpiper, as the name implies, is a little guy. He's one of the smaller peeps. But one way that you identify it is to look at the very pointy end of the beak. Some are much more rounded in terms of the similar species. So we can still use these for field marking training, but we really have the best of both worlds here because we also have the data labels that go with them. Here's a couple other examples of some series I wanted to show you here. On the left, we have the eastern towhee, a very common bird that we can find in parks in your backyard and so forth. And on the right, a bird that's not rare, but maybe a little more elusive. It's one of the top-level predators in the bird world, a sharp-shinned hawk. It's one of the smaller hawks, and it relies primarily on hunting avian prey. So think of things like small ducks or songbirds are a favored target. If we start with the towhee on the left, again, we got all the proper data labels set up, so that's good. We have primarily males here, but you see this one here that has the light-colored chin. That's a juvenile. So having a series is very important because you have the ability to look at variation within populations. You can also, therefore, because we have historic collections, look at change over time. We can't go back in time, but we can preserve these historic collections. And nowadays, we have methods that we use to take measurements on birds where we don't have to take them and add them to collections. We can live capture them, collect measurements, and in modern times, what we also do is we collect blood samples. Now, why is that? What are we going to get out of a blood sample? DNA, right? You get the genetic material, not just for sequencing all the little, base pairs in the DNA, but there's so much that we can do with DNA today, looking at the evolutionary history, look at change over time in the short term, and so forth, looking at populations that might become genetically very limited, or maybe conservation successes where they are diversifying in terms of their gene pool. So these are all very important. So here we have a couple of males, we have a juvenile, and it's a little hard to make out, but this individual here has a much lighter head than the others. That's a female there. So we already have a number of differences that we can see just looking down this series right here, but when we get down into the weeds, we find many other differences. Now over here with the sharp-shinned hawks, this is a great example. There's another very closely related species called the Cooper's hawk. There's some slight differences in field markings, but they're tough, but one of the main differences is that the Cooper's hawk is bigger than the sharp-shinned hawk. But when you're out in the field and you see one bird, that's a tough thing to figure out. Is that a big bird or is that a little bird, right? So, but it's tough. And the other thing, too, is what they say in all the identification guides is that a big sharp-shinned is about as big as a small Cooper's hawk. And then you start like slapping your forehead and wondering what the heck to do. So then you got to get into the greater details. And what this series here shows very nicely is that these are all sharp-shinned, but look at the difference in size. This individual here is quite large, and this would be about the size of a small Cooper's hawk, and the rest here may be a little more typical of sharp-shins. Incidentally, it's hard to see in the slide, but take my word for it, both of these specimens were collected in Washington in 1885, and we're still able to use it. That's the beauty of museum collections. Collect these things in perpetuity. Just think if you wanted to do a study of birds, how much money and time you would have to invest if you had to go get measurements and run all over the map to get what you need. You can come to museums. They're a money saver for researchers who study organismal biology. So just to reinforce our point here are a couple of pictures from Cornell about the sharp-shinned hawk. Well, actually, this is the National Audubon Society, and the Cooper's hawk. The sharp-shinned hawk has what's called a more squared-off tail than the rounded tail of the Cooper's. That is pretty easy to see. And another one is that the sharp-shinned has a dark cap, but the nape of the neck is also dark. This isn't the best angle, but you get the idea. The Cooper's hawk has a dark cap, but the nape of the neck is pale. And so those are the things that you're looking for. And that's just another fun thing about these things. It's just the challenge, You think guys, trying to sink a putt at 30 feet get excited, man, when you can figure out the color of the nape of the neck of one of these hawks. Oh, man. Right, I'm telling you, gets you riled up. But there's more. As you saw with the brown pelican in my opening slide, we also have an historic egg collection. Eggs were. We don't encourage this anymore. In fact, it's against the law. You can't do this. Eggs were highly sought after, especially during Victorian era, and you had, men of leisure who were going out and finding ways to spend their time, and they were collecting and showing off egg collections. It was a big thing. And you can see a number of them have these holes perforating. Well, that's a speck. They have these holes perforating them. You have to blow out the contents. You can't just store an egg with the albumin and everything on the inside. It's going to start to smell. So you actually put a pinhole in one end, and then you use a very fine drill to drill through it. You can drain the contents, and then you can rinse it out, and then you have this egg collection. And I will say about these Victorian collectors, they were meticulous with keeping records, and we'll continue to talk about that as time goes on. So just a couple of quick stories as I was researching this talk. Because I have to admit that, my knowledge of, how to actually clean out one of these eggs was limited, so I was trying to bone up on it, and I came across a couple of stories. People were so enthusiastic about collecting these eggs. There was one point, there was an American soldier, and he was in some conflict zone, and there were bullets flying, but he noticed there was a large nest up in a tree, right, between the two positions, right? And so he made a mad dash for it. He was an officer. He made a mad dash for it, managed to climb the tree, get into the nest, collect one egg. And it was fairly sizable, but now he has to climb down. So apparently, and I found the story on different reasonable sites. This wasn't made up. And he ends up jamming the egg into his mouth to keep it closed, or keep it safe. but it was sort of like that time at the bar late at night when your friend wants to bet you that he can fit that cue ball into his mouth, right? And it causes problems. Well, he did descend from the tree, runs back to his position, doesn't get hurt, but then his men couldn't get the egg out, and he was so desperate to not break it, he made them remove one of his teeth to produce room to get the egg out. And then, unfortunately, there was also another account where there was an experienced collector who made his way up into a tree, and he was using climbing ropes, and as he descended with a nest and egg set, he had an accident and fell awkwardly in such a way that he got strung up and hung by his own climbing gear, and it snapped his neck. So so there's a lot of passion. I'm not going to be running up. I'm a little scared of heights, so I'm not running up there to observe what's inside eggs. That's what drones are for. All right. We don't do that either. We try our best not to stress birds with our activities. So here's kind of a close-up showing that very fine drill hole. This is I just thought this was an interesting egg because in a lot of cases they wrote the collecting data right on the egg. This is what it's called. There's no such thing that I could find, a white-black skimmer. We have the black skimmer, so I'm not sure where this came from, but it was collected not in 2016, but 1916, and it's a fascinating bird. Here is a juvenile in the front and an adult in the back. They're not rare. You have to go to the right place to find them, where they can be abundant. As you notice, the lower beak is longer than the upper beak, and they're given that name black skimmer by skimming over the water with that lower beak in there, and you can see them kind of flick their head when they make contact with a fish, and they scoop it up with that lower beak. So fascinating, beautiful birds, amongst one of my favorite. But so some of the collectors use the eggs as their data label, which again, we don't encourage. Here is a close-up just to show that fine hole that is in some eggs. These are horned larks, and you see the speckling on the eggs. We're going to cover speckling on eggs here, which is very interesting. Here's a male horned lark. It's got those little horns. There are specialized feathers that differentiate the males from the females. A female looks a lot like this. Take away the horns and take away the yellow in the face and change it with white, and you understand what she looks like. So pretty cool, but that kind of gives you a good look at that idea of blowing out eggs using those fine drills. Here's an American redstart. It's one of our warblers, right? Now, again, you can see all the speckling on the egg and so forth, but this is just fascinating, again, to get back into this. This was collected, I kind of purposely pulled this out, Lake County, Ohio, which you can see right here. It's very close where I used to live when I was a curator at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. This was collected May 31st in 1903. Right, so, and we have a bunch of information, very difficult to read. I also wanted to point out that what you see at various historical sites that have documents, so for instance, Library of Congress has massive amounts of old handwritten documents from the government, and they're actually looking for volunteers who can read cursive, right? Because so many people can't read cursive anymore, so they look for volunteers to translate. It's all in English, but it is in cursive. And so we have the same problem here. It's not bad handwriting, but it's just so stylistic. It can be very difficult, and we often put our heads together puzzling over what is on these particular labels. But they talk about the height, the kind of tree, how far out on a limb it was, and when you read some of these things, you know that these collectors were quite acrobatic. Right? Oh, shoot. Here, let me kind of close it out. All right, I forgot I had a question for you here. So it's the speckling, right? So here we got 4 eggs of the American redstart. You can see a couple of the holes. This here is a little damage. I don't know if it was damaged by the collector or damaged during transfer or something like that. Why would eggs be speckled? What does that do for the bird? Anytime you see in nature an investment by an organism in, say, things like color or something like that, there's got to be a reason. It doesn't just happen randomly. So why? I heard someone say it. Say it again. Yeah, camouflage, right? So a lot of people say camouflage, right? So let's go back to the slide that I went to prematurely, right? In some cases, that is definitely true. Had to put a shout out to the piping plovers that I worked with as an intern. Here's an adult here. The nest isn't anything special. It's a depression in the sand. sometimes lined with shells. This one has a modest lining of shells. Sometimes they're a little more dense. Here are 2 speckled eggs, and here's 1 chick and 2 chick. These are what we call precocial chicks that within just a matter of minutes or just an hour or 2, they will actually stand up and start running around foraging. Once they get out of the egg, they are very, very active. They look like little ping pong balls with long legs, right? And it's very cool. But part of my job is to drive around a pickup truck and look for active adults. And when I would find one, I would have to watch. And then the hope was I would eventually see an adult go and sit down. And that meant, hopefully, that male or female was sitting on a batch of eggs. And I'd have to go up and see if the eggs were there. And if they were, I'd have to count them. And then we would mark the site to come back to, because what we had problems with, it's endangered species, were foxes depredating the eggs. They would just show up in the middle of the night and they would eat the eggs up, or maybe even consume the adult. So we would put up these things called exclosures, basically baskets around the egg that were of big enough size that the mesh of the exclosure would prevent the fox from getting to the eggs, but the adults could run back and forth as they foraged and changed off sitting on the nest and so forth. So this is a definite example. Sometimes you knew there had to be a nest there because the doggone bird was sitting down and you still are sitting there going, and you can only look for a couple minutes. You don't want to keep the bird away from the nest for too long because the sun's beating down on the eggs and they're trying to incubate it and keep them at a constant temperature. So if you couldn't find it, you got frustrated and you had to go away and would have to come back. So, but these were very effective. In this picture, it looks like they're very obvious out in the field. This camouflage works great. And we're going to come back to, because it's not just camouflage. There's another bit of story here. Hang on, I have a timer here just to make sure I stay on time. We're doing good. All right, so here's a dusky cap flycatcher. This is a species that lives out in the west. This was a very interesting batch of eggs here. What do you notice about it? Did somebody say one's different? How dare you? No, it's true, 100%, right? We're looking right here. This guy right here has a finer speckling. These are the dusky cap flycatcher eggs. These are, this here is a nest from a brood parasite, right? You probably have heard of this if you're a birder. These are cowbirds, female on the left, male on the right, attractive bird. But what they will do is they'll lay an egg in the nest of a nesting pair of birds and leave it. And the egg will develop rapidly, the chick will hatch out more quickly, and it grows more quickly, sometimes forcing and pushing the other young out, or just simply monopolizing the attention of the mother and father, and the host birds are no wiser. Here's a Wilson's warbler, nests up north, and this is one of the parents. The male and female look very similar to one another, but here is a cowbird chick. They don't know the difference. They're just like, oh my God, you gotten big. But they just keep feeding, right? And I've watched this in nature. I have found nests that have cowbird chicks in it, and it's ridiculous to see, but it's what happens. So cowbirds and songbirds, the rest of the songbirds, they had a balance in nature. They were not a problem. But as we have reduced our forest resources and fragmented it and created a lot of edge around them and reduce the size of these forests so there's less interior space. Cowbirds don't like to go to the interior forest, they work the edges, but as we have more and more forest fragmentation and more edge, cowbirds have been more and more successful, right? And there's more. We have nests as well, which is a lot of fun. Here's a mallard nest, for example, with a nice egg set and a data label. We love this, right? That's what we like to see. So here is the willow goldfinch. This is a Western thing, but it doesn't exist anymore. The willow goldfish and the American goldfinch are the same species. Again, this was a synonymy, right? But a great label that talks about where the nest was. So we can see here that this was in a spruce tree, 6 feet out on a limb, about 12 feet up. And so again, this person had to use either some climbing skills or a ladder or something to gain access to it. But again, it's nice to save these things for conservation purposes. Here is the technical subspecies now, the willow goldfinch from out west, but it's virtually identical to our American goldfinch that we're also familiar with, right? So, this picture here, I hope it shows up to you out here, but these are Ohio house wrens, but that doesn't exist anymore either. You know, these are old. These were collected in 1923. We now just know them as house wren. There is no Ohio house wren. and we have a nice nest egg set. But you can see that these are a little more pink. There is more than just the original protein that we should have mentioned when I was talking about the piping plover. What birds do as the egg is being produced, late in the stage, it will deposit protoporphyrin it's a protein, onto the egg. And as such, what happens is where the protoporphyrin is deposited on the egg, it can reinforce the egg's strength. So where we see pigment, the eggs tend to be stronger. There is a second one called biliverdin, which also strengthens the egg, but it also adds color, right? And depending upon the combination of these two proteins, you can get either blue or red, or in the case of the house wren, you can get this kind of pinkish color. So why would eggs be colored? Why would they have a particular color to them? So we talked about camouflage. That makes sense. You know, they're kind of a dull color, right? But why would they be blue or pink or maybe even a reddish color? Anybody have any ideas? That's an interesting idea, this idea of aposematic coloration or warning coloration. It doesn't appear to be the case. And I'll be blunt with you, I didn't know. I had to look this up, but it just kind of occurred to me. I've been looking at birds for decades, never really thought to be like, well, why are they colored? And as it turns out, we still don't know, right? Yeah, so we do know that when we look at eggs and we look at where the protoporphyrin or the biliverdin is deposited, that egg is reinforced, but the reason for the color sometimes doesn't make sense. Why would we color some of these eggs? Well, there's an interesting I'm just throwing this out there. I am not saying this is what it is, but I was reading about it. It's an interesting thought. It's a way from an evolutionary perspective for the female to basically blackmail the male to sit on the eggs. In other words, if you've got a nest out in the open, made with natural materials, but you have these bright eggs, when the female is ready to get off and go forage, right, now the male has a choice. It's not my job, but then, if it's not my job, those eggs are exposed and they might get eaten by something because they're kind of brightly colored. Or, on the other hand, it might be the other way around. Like, oh my God, I got to go sit on these eggs because they're brightly colored. I better hide them, right? I don't know if that's true. It's a hypothesis. I think it just goes to show you that there's so much left to learn in science, and collections can help get us there. All right, we're in the home stretch here with a few more examples. Eastern wood pewee, beautiful little flycatcher. You can see the deposits of these proteins right on the kind of widest part of the eggs. So I think that would be strategic, but I don't really know that. But I think it's a beautiful example of kind of strategic placement of these proteins for strengthening the eggs, right? And then here we have Irving. This is the collector of this pewee. The reason I put this down here is because I kind of wanted to know, who are these people who collected eggs back in the day? These were collected in June of 1909, right? We're not going to be able to ask them, right? They're long gone. And so we're going to come back to that. But one other thing that was it was really cool, is I'm running around taking pictures in our bird collection, and the nests and everything else like that. I came across a cabinet that I guess I'd never opened before, and it had these boxes that were just nondescript. I said, well, what's in here? And I pull these things out. We have, and it's completely undocumented, it was just something we haven't gotten to as an institution, we have a pretty extensive feather reference collection. And I didn't know stuff like this existed, to be blunt. Right? So what this is the northern saw-whet owl, and in this particular case we have these sheets where feathers have been removed from the bird and then secured with notes. And so here are some close-ups here, some of the primary tail feathers of the northern saw-whet owl, right? An owl that we can find if you go over into western Rockingham County or up into Highland County, up at higher altitudes. We can find it here in Virginia, right? So here are some of the they call them the tail coverts, right? So they're underneath the tail, so forth. Here's another part of the tail and whatnot. So this is really cool. And there is actually, I didn't know this until I was prepping for this talk, but there is an international feather identification page that has mounts like this. And so some of the staff, we all got excited poking through this because we found some endangered species too, which was neat. And so what we're going to do is we're going to scan these and upload them to this international database. Here's a pinion jay, just a beautiful job that these people did back in the day. Here's some close-ups of some of these pinyon jay feathers and so forth. They're 100+ years old. They still are beautiful, right? Some specimens, we don't know what they are, but we just have them wrapped up in newspaper, the collector just never got around to mounting them. So what we do with them next, we haven't really figured that out yet. This is all a new project for us, but it was just a real joy to kind of come across this collection. So let me end with kind of a conservation message here. As I said, I kind of got interested, well, who are these people that, collected these things? What kind of people were they? So I came across this publication because I was searching for a particular collector. And as we begin to go through it, so bear with me here, here's Irving. His name is listed on some of the really dense labels that I showed you. So let me just kind of walk you through this here. I'm going to paraphrase here, but the author of this book had written that it is commonly stated that the bald eagle will not lay a second set of eggs after the first have been taken. A fine set of eggs were taken on December 5th, 1909 by Frank Irving and are now in his collection. This pair of birds laid again, and the young of the second litter were taking their first lessons in flying on the 10th of April. A second nest that was robbed on the 12th of December contained young on the 3rd of April, right? So through the process of stealing eggs from active nests yielded information. Kind of have to wonder about the ethics of that, though. Another common statement is that these eagles mate for life. On March 13th, I killed a male bird near a nest containing young. Again, an ethical thing. This was a fully matured pair of birds which the owner of the property desired to have destroyed. Can't do that anymore. And they were very closely watched. Only 3 days later, on the 16th, it was reported that the female bird had another mate. Okay, interesting. This was proved to be true the next day when the immature male bird was found feeding the young in her company. The nest was successfully photographed from a neighboring tree. Neither of the old birds came near enough to get the picture. All of them, however, are now in private collections, right? This is depressing, right? So I would like to say 100% that our ethics and our kind of disposition towards collecting has changed quite a bit. We still take birds into our collection, but they are all salvages. Every museum curator has a professional salvage permit issued to them by the Commonwealth, renewed annually. And as such, we have to report back to the Commonwealth anything we add to the collection. When we get window strike or vehicle kill, we will take a genetic sample, and we have a freezer. We have a set of freezers that are cryogenic, and we are storing the DNA of these species. And then we take and mount the study skin, but we also will actually cut a wing off and spread them, because as you saw in the study skins, you can't see the wing. So there is a much different kind of disposition and kind of a mentality and ethic that we put towards collecting these days, and certainly you will not see this anymore, not in the United States. It will not be tolerated. But we still are committed to holding these collections in perpetuity so we can continue to learn from them. So here's a little whimsical picture I took of a collection of birds. This was a private collector who he passed, and then in March of 2020, you all remember March of 2020. Yeah, right? I got a call from a guy, and I'm sitting there, I was talking to someone, I was like, hey, what is this COVID? What the hell's going on? And I get this call from a guy, and he says, hey, my uncle, he was a duck hunter, and he has taxidermied specimens of every species from Virginia, male and female, and they're in his house, but his house was sold, and it's dilapidated, and they're going to bulldoze it. Can you take the collection out to your museum? And I said, yeah, that'd be great. Man, this is because he texted me a couple photos, and they look beautiful. And he said, okay, here's the catch. They're going to bulldoze on Friday. I was like, I'll be right there. So we got a U-Haul, and we drove all the way up to Fairfax at the start of a pandemic, and we sat there and we signed over the paperwork. The basement was flooded. They were all hung up on walls, and we were able to get these, and this is just a fraction of them, right? So all that said, these are valuable taxidermy specimens. The study skins are irreplaceable. We're not going to get many more. We'll get some through salvage and so forth, but we're just not going to get more, as should be the case. I hope this will inspire you to go out and, instead of enjoying the birds through taxidermy and stuff, actually what I should say is you should use the taxidermy as a complement to learning, but then to get out into nature yourself and then continue to enjoy these species. So with that, I will take time for a few questions, and then I will be glad to stick around, because it's 8 o'clock now. I'll be glad to stick around and take any one-on-one questions. So if you have a question, I think Tom is going to take the microphone around, please speak into the microphone so the people online can hear.
Hi. You described the ducks that were posed in lifelike positions as being preserved through taxidermy, but the study skins, how are they preserved? Are they also stuffed?
That's a good question. So in taxidermy, the artist has to make a form. And in the old days, they used a variety of materials, including plaster and stuff. Nowadays, they use lighter materials like fiberglass to create a form in which you sew the skin over. And it is indeed an art form. With the study skins, they are stuffed with cotton. Cotton is acid-free, and as such will not degrade the bird over time. There is no other special consideration. We minimize handling. We wash our hands before handling them. We used to use gloves, but then it was determined that the stickiness of the nylon was enough to kind of yank feathers or even damage books. If you handle-wear books, wash your hands, thoroughly dry them, turn your pages, and so forth. So most of these natural history museum specimens are very, very durable should you keep them under the right conditions. Good question. Yes?
Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Is the shape that is getting at the end just an artistic representation or an observation of how the bird is landing or getting to flight? Or just an artistic representation?
Yeah, Angel, that's a great question. So in this case, I really do feel the artist, the fellow who died, he not only hunted, but he also got training in taxidermy, according to his nephew. I think they really captured the element of the animal. I have seen some terrible taxidermy, right? I mean, these things just look terrible. It's like, I mean, that just does not look like the animal would be in nature. In this case, they pose them so they have lifelike either flight poses or with this scaup right here, right? This guy, he's my favorite because he looks like he's smiling, right? But he's actually coming in for a landing, right? And whatnot. So, we have some beautiful taxidermy of predator-prey interactions and so forth, and some of these artists are really good. Some of them not so good. Those are way in the back of the collection, right? We don't break those out for display. So yeah, good question. I know I've already said this, but I'll reinforce it. Taxidermy, even though again I will say that I don't encourage people to go out and take wild animals just for the sake of trophies and so forth. But all that said, the artists are very impressive with their skill set. I think we had a question up here. We're in the back.
Is there someone we could contact if we find a bird that is dead and in perfect shape? Do people still want to use the birds?
Yeah. So if you find a dead bird and you think it's salvageable, or maybe you're just passionate and you want to see that animal kind of have a second life, so to speak, such that it will have an education value. One, you can contact your local Department of Wildlife Resources office. A lot of them will, like over in Verona, they do have freezers where they put animals or fish or birds that were salvaged, and they'll hold them for us, and we do a periodic pickup. Not every office will do that, but the ones we have relationships with. Or you can certainly call the Natural History Museum. You can freeze these. Just be careful when you have company come over and they're going to get ice cubes, right? It's happened to me before, right? You know, because I had more dead things in my freezer than I had cheeseburgers or something. So anyway, but yeah, you can do this. You can contact the museum. You can certainly contact DWR. In fact, some of you may have heard news reports this morning that because of spread of avian flu, if you find congregations of dead shorebirds or vultures, in particular the black vulture, there's the turkey vulture and the black vultures have the black head. If you find groups that are laying around perished, you should contact anyone in DWR and let them know the exact location. Do not handle the bird. They are trying to track and learn from the spread of avian flu. So
I have a question about the protein that's on the eggs. How does it get on there? I mean, is it just part of the birth process?
hey, raise your hand where you're at. I missed you.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there
right
you
here.
are. Okay, great question. Yeah, so basically, if you start with the uterus and then you go down to the cloaca of the bird, there's a series of steps where you have, basically the what's going to become a bird is lay down first, and you get the albumin placed around that, and then you come to an area where the calcium is laid down. And I didn't mention this before, but in some diets, calcium is lacking. It just depends upon the location and so forth, and that's a thought behind the adaptation of laying down the protein to strengthen that calcium if it's relatively thin. That's right before the egg is laid. So you have a gland that deposits it, and one thing I haven't quite wrapped my head around how this really works is you already have the calcium laid around the egg. When you break an egg, like by accident, or you can look in these eggs that are colored where the drill hole is, you can shine a light on it, that protein permeates the entire shell. It's not just a surface coating, right? So that's something I'm still trying to comprehend. I don't know how that whole process. But basically there is a gland specific to the deposition of those two proteins, and then very shortly after, whoop, the egg is laid. All right. I have time for one more question before we let you go. We'll take one more up front here, and then again, I'll stick around for any one-on-one questions that you may have.
Hi. First of all, this was wonderful.
Okay.
But I had a question about the preventing mites or bugs and all that. Those collections that are 100 years old, it just seems like there would be something in the feathers. Do you have to do any kind of precaution?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, anytime we bring something new into the collection, let's say a university donates a teaching collection that we feel can complement what we have, the very first thing we do is we run it through a 60% carbon dioxide environment. We have a big tent we call the bubble, and we pump CO2 into it for 2 weeks while the specimens sit in there. And if we have any silverfish or earwigs or domestic beetles or odd beetles or any of these other things that can be pests and so forth, they will perish for sure. So that is sort of like our preventative, what we call IPM, or integrated pest management process, before we bring the collections back to the vaults. But what's interesting about that too is that years ago, when I was at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, I was contacted by a Russian fella, and he said, hey, do you have any ivory-billed woodpeckers? Right? Now, some people think the ivory-billed woodpecker still exists. I might not be one of them. I'm pretty sure that thing's extinct. But he said, do you have any in the collection? I said, yeah, we have 3. He said, can you take a lice comb and go through the feathers? And so these specimens were like the ones I showed you earlier, they were like 100 years old plus. And so I got these 3 specimens, and with the permission of the curator, and we combed them out, and lo and behold, we found parasites. These aren't the ones that eat the feathers that are going to damage your collections. These are the ones that are blood feeders feeding on the living organism and never made the escape when the animal died. And so we got these 100-year-old parasites, and we popped them in alcohol, and we sent them to this guy in Russia, and he loved them, right? He mounted them all up and published a paper on it, and it was really cool. We were very excited about the whole thing. So, all right, thank you all very much. I think next month, thank you. Yeah, next month we have another talk that Tom will describe.
Yeah, so please join us. Please join us next month. Our talk will be actually on Veterans Day, Tuesday, November 11th. And so we actually plan to talk to commemorate veterans as well as the gray berets of today who quietly and without recognition provide technical and strategic weather forecasts on which successful military campaigns rely. So it's a little bit of science and military history. And the title is, Here's to Our Weather Warriors. And our speaker is John Ross. He's an author, and he wrote a book called The Forecast for D-Day and the Weathermen Behind Ike's Greatest Gamble. So I hope you'll join us for that. And again, if you have any questions about the Waynesboro campus or how to promote with the governor in the budget coming up, please stop by, and hope I'll see you in November.